Hey, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're turning those happy little improvisational tree blocks we made last month into a finished quilt top. And along the way, I'll share quick layout and assembly tips you can use in any quilt project, not just this one. If you saw part one, you already know how fun these quilt blocks are to make. But if you're just joining us now, don't worry, you can jump right in. If you've been sewing along with me, we now have a wide variety of tree shapes and sizes, colors, and levels of contrast, with some trunks wide, some skinny, and some trees set back a bit from the foreground. To get even more variety with my trees, I also experimented with stacking and cutting my fabric without adding a tree trunk. And I want to credit at Quilted Jewels 4631 for suggesting this in the comments. Thanks so much for the fun idea. I also introduced blocks with the trees set flush to the bottom of the block. As I said before, there really are no rules. I'll pause here for just a second to recognize Karla Alexander's contribution to the quilt world with her Stack the Deck books. That's where I first learned about this improvisational method, and I've been happily playing with it ever since. I called these blocks happy little trees because, just like Bob Ross used to say, it's all about enjoying the process and letting little surprises happen along the way. Each block turns out a little differently, and that's what makes the quilt so fun and personal. Once you've sewn up a happy little forest, the real fun begins, deciding how to arrange them. That's what we're going to talk about today. Whether you're making a wall hanging, table runner, pillow, or full-size quilt, a few simple design tricks can help your block shine. Quick and festive table runners, pillows, or other small projects are easy to whip up. You can skip borders for a little more modern look, or you can add one or more borders for a more classic look. You can also play with different border widths and colors, like I'm doing here. You could also introduce sashing between the blocks, as shown in these samples. Using the same fabric for the sashing and borders can visually float the blocks, which can be a very cool effect. I played with lining up my blocks in rows by background color, which I really liked, until I realized that in my commitment to a scrappy look, I hadn't counted ahead of time to figure out how much I was using of each color, so I didn't have enough to make it come out right. I also tried sorting my blocks into relatively light and relatively dark backgrounds and creating a checkerboard effect, which I found very appealing. It may be easier to see what I mean when I take out the color. Some of these light backgrounds are busy prints, but in grayscale, it's easier to see that they're lighter in value than the blocks next to them. That's the key. This trick isn't just for Christmas trees. It's a great way to double-check fabric contrast in any quilt. Let me show you real quickly how this works if you've never done it before. It's pretty easy to do on a smartphone. Now, your phone might look a little different from mine, but the functions should be similar. Start by opening up your photo app and selecting Edit. You might see the word Edit, or you might see what looks like a little pencil. If you see the option, select Adjust. Sometimes you just might see what looks like a little sunburst or a sort of clock shape instead of the word itself. Look for Saturation, and then slide the bar left all the way to -100 to remove all the color in the photo. Now, don't save over your original photo. Save a copy of the photo so that you'll still have your original. And that's all there is to it. But it can really be a very useful design tool. Okay, let's get back to quilt layout. In the end, I decided to go for a full-on scrappy look that joyfully mixes up the colors and values. If I remove the color so that you can see the layout in grayscale, I hope you can see that I abandoned a formal checkerboard and went for balance over strict symmetry as I laid out my blocks. I wanted to keep the viewer's eyes moving across the face of the quilt. Now, I want to take a minute to share something that might catch you by surprise. Do you see the block that I've circled in red? That tree seems to have disappeared. That's because even though the tree and the background of the block are different colors, they're almost the same in value, which is the relative lightness or darkness of the color. Check this out when we put the color back in. The red tree shows up nicely now, so it's nothing to worry about. This happened to some of my other blocks too. Now, I enjoy the dynamic effect that's created by varying the amount of contrast between the trees and the background. Before we go any further, we need to take a sec to talk about quilt sizes. Here are some suggested layouts from baby quilt to queen size. And don't worry about memorizing the numbers. You can always screenshot or pause this chart, which can help you determine how many 7-inch by 9-inch blocks you want to make. Please pay attention not just to the quilt size column, but also to the finished size column, as mattress measurements may vary. If you'd like to make your quilts a little bit larger, emphasize a certain color, or bring in a calming element, you can add one or more borders, just as we discussed earlier. Here's another table. The suggested block layouts for each size are the same, but the finished sizes are just a bit larger because I've added a 3.5-inch cut size border all the way around. As always, you can go wider, narrower, or even use more than one border if you prefer. Once you've finished your layout, it's time to start sewing everything together. I'll walk you through the process that I use to keep everything organized and aligned. We'll start by sewing the blocks together in rows. A quick tip: I like to use masking tape or painter's tape to create labels for my rows. I like to stick the tape on my cutting mat first for easy writing, and I use my paper-only rotary cutter to cut between the labels. I find it helpful not only to label each row, but also to indicate the direction in which I intend to press the seam allowances for that row. Here's how my blocks look, all laid out next to my sewing machine and ready to go. Each pile has a label to help me keep track of which row it is and how I want to press the seam allowances between the blocks. This is especially helpful if you don't have long stretches in which to sew. If you have lots of interruptions, this makes it easy to figure out where you are when you come back. You can pin or clip the blocks together, but I find that unnecessary since my sewing machine has a large enough extension table that it's easy to keep the blocks lined up with each other. I'm using my 1/4-inch foot to keep my seam allowances nice and consistent. It's so much fun to see the rows start to grow. And here we'll give you a little peek. Isn't that fun? If you don't have a 1/4-inch presser foot, you might consider creating a temporary guide with masking tape or painter's tape. Here I've positioned my ruler so that the needle comes down right on that 1/4-inch line, and I've lined up the tape with the edge of the ruler. You'd need to peel back the tape to refill the bobbin, but it can be a great help if you ever have trouble sewing with a consistent 1/4-inch seam. It's a handy guide, and it's easily removable, and it doesn't leave any stickiness on your machine. And here we'll pull it out. There we go. Works great. When joining the blocks to create rows, I prefer to press the vertical seam allowances between the blocks in alternating directions so that the seams will nest when I sew the rows together. For example, all of the vertical seams in this row have been pressed towards the left, while all of the vertical seams in this row have been pressed towards the right. If you prefer to press all of your seam allowances open, that's okay too. The labels, which you can see way on the left side of this photo, make it much easier to keep everything in the right order as I'm assembling each row individually and then as I'm joining the rows together. Once the rows have been sewn, it's time to assemble the body of the quilt. And I'll let you in on a little secret here. If you look very closely, you might notice that these blocks haven't actually been sewn together yet. I'm using mock-ups for the final steps, as that's easier for me than getting a bunch of photographs of the entire quilt while I'm working by myself in a small studio space. Do your best to match up the intersections without overstressing. Pins or clips can be a big help at this stage. This photo shows what it looks like when the seams nest. I find this method really helpful when matching up intersections. I like to start by sewing in sets of 2, joining rows 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and so on. If you have an odd number of rows, you'll have a lonely orphan at the end of this stage, but don't worry, they'll get added in during another round. I recommend pressing all of these long horizontal seams all towards the bottom of the quilt, all in the same direction. Or you can press them open if you'd like to help your quilt top lay just a tiny bit flatter by reducing the bulk of the seam allowances. I'll continue joining the sections together in pairs, pressing the seam allowances either open or down towards the bottom of the quilt. I find that working in sections like this makes it a lot easier to handle the quilt top as I'm assembling it than adding one row at a time to a growing quilt top would be. And there we have it. All the rows have been sewn together. When it comes time to cut any optional borders you'd like to add, I strongly suggest that you first measure through the center of your quilt to determine how long the borders will need to be. This will usually be a much more reliable measurement than measuring along the outer edges of the quilt top might have stretched a little. Cut both side borders at the same time to exactly the same measurement. I cut my border for this quilt 3.5 inches wide, but you can go wider or narrower if you wish, or you can leave the border off. When pinning or clipping a long border or sashing strip to the body of a quilt, it really helps to first pin or clip the beginning and end of the strip that you're adding. Then pin or clip in the middle, making sure that the strip is nice and flat and that the edges are all lined up evenly. Then between those pins or clips, then between those pins or clips until the entire length has been secured. This way, if there's any excess length in either your border or your quilt top, it will be evenly distributed, and you won't end up with wonky sides, uneven borders, or tucks along the border seams. Sew each border to the body of the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam. I also suggest backstitching or using a locking stitch at the beginning and end of these long seams to prevent the stitches from sliding out of the fabric later, especially when you get to the basting and quilting process. Once the side borders have been sewn, measure through the center of the quilt horizontally to determine how long your top and bottom borders should be. If you're adding, cut, pin, and sew the borders just as before. And here we are. I'll share the completed quilt in another video so that you'll be able to see how I chose to quilt it, but it may be a few weeks. If you'd like some extra help with the basting process, I've linked my spray basting and pin basting tutorials in the description box below. And if you missed part 1, you'll find that video linked too, so that you can see exactly how easy it is to make these fun improvisational tree blocks. If you enjoyed this project and want more scrappy, playful quilt ideas in future videos, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next, and I'd love a thumbs up if you found this helpful. And if you create your own version I'd love to see it. Tag me on Instagram or share in the comments. Until next time, happy quilting!